The most dangerous woman in history you've never heard of. If I asked you to name the most dangerous woman in history, who would come to mind? Cleopatra? Marie Antoinette? Maybe a spy or assassin from a Netflix series? What if I told you the real answer isn't someone you've ever heard of? And yet, she ruled the most powerful empire on earth, crushed her enemies, rewrote history, and made herself emperor in a world where women weren't even allowed to speak in court? This is the story of Wu Zetian, the only woman in 3,000 years of Chinese imperial history to rule in her own name. Not as a queen, not as a regent, not as a puppet, as emperor. She didn't just hold power, she mastered it. She turned whispers into weapons, and when people said a woman can't rule, she made them disappear. Wu Zetian rose from the bottom, a teenage concubine in the emperor's palace, to become the most powerful person in the Tang dynasty, a dynasty that, at its peak, rivaled Rome in its glory and the Mongols in its reach. The most dangerous woman in history. You've never heard of, and she didn't do it by being nice. She used spies. She used propaganda. She turned religion into her PR department. She had rivals killed, and sometimes her own children. But she also stabilized a fractured empire, protected the Silk Road, promoted scholars, elevated the status of women, and terrified generations of men so badly they tried to erase her name from the history books. For centuries, she was described as a monster, a seductress, a murderer, a witch. But what if she wasn't the villain? What if she was the product of a system that only respected power? And she just played the game better than anyone else. This is the story of how one woman broke every rule, seized the throne, and became the most dangerous woman in history. The one you've probably never even heard of. And by the end of this video, you'll never forget her name, Wu Zetian. Before she was the Empress of China, before she held the Dragon Throne, Wu Zetian was just a name on a palace roster. One of many teenage girls summoned to the imperial court as a concubine. The most dangerous woman in history. You've never heard of. She was 14 years old, and the man she was supposed to impress? Emperor Taizong, ruler of the mighty Tang dynasty. But Wu didn't come from nothing. She was born into a wealthy family in 624 AD. Her father was a successful timber merchant with connections, and unlike many families of the time, he gave his daughter an education. Wu could read, she could write, she knew history, politics, poetry, things women weren't expected to know, let alone use. When she entered the palace, she wasn't at the top. She was just one of many, a talented lady, a low-ranking concubine with almost no access to the emperor. But Wu was observant, quiet, strategic. While others fought for attention, she watched. She studied the power games. She learned how the court worked, the factions, the gossip, the alliances, the betrayals. And she waited. Wu wasn't the emperor's favorite, not by a long shot. But she left an impression. She served in the imperial library, handled documents, overheard secrets, and when Emperor Taizong died, everything should have ended for her. The most dangerous woman in history you've never heard of. Because palace rules were clear. When an emperor died, his concubines who had not borne him sons were sent to Buddhist convents, locked away, out of sight, out of history. Wu was 25 when she was sent to a convent. Her career should have been over. But Wu Zetian had no intention of fading quietly. Here's where her story takes a dramatic turn, and where most historical figures would be lost to time. Instead, Wu did something unthinkable. She seduced the next emperor. Li Zhi, Emperor Gaozong, had once been a young prince in his father's court. Wu had caught his eye years earlier, when she was just another girl in his father's harem. Now, as emperor, he remembered her. He brought her back to the palace. Against every tradition, against the objections of his court, against the outrage of his wife, the Empress Wang. Wu Zetian returned not just as a woman, but as a force. She became Gaozong's favorite, gave him children, whispered advice, moved through the palace the most dangerous woman in history you've never heard of with quiet authority. And she wasn't content with being a favorite. She wanted more. She began maneuvering her rivals, including Empress Wang, into disgrace. Slowly, subtly, brilliantly, she used alliances, blackmail, rumors, facts, whatever worked. By the time she was officially named Empress herself, Wu Zetian was no longer the girl in the shadows. She was the woman behind the throne, and she was just getting started. Becoming Empress was only step one. Wu Zetian didn't want to sit beside power. She wanted to hold it. But to do that in the Tang dynasty, as a woman, meant rewriting the rules without anyone noticing. At least not at first. So how did she do it? Simple. She built a shadow empire. The most dangerous woman in history. You've never heard of Wu Zetian became the emperor's closest advisor. She managed court appointments. She read and edited imperial edicts. She surrounded herself with loyal officials, not always aristocrats, but educated men from lower classes who owed their careers to her. She created a pipeline of loyalty. While Emperor Gaozong ruled publicly, Wu ruled privately. He trusted her judgment, relied on her instincts, and increasingly let her make decisions. Some historians believe he may have suffered strokes or seizures, making him dependent on her. Others say she simply outmaneuvered everyone around him, and no one dared challenge her, because those who did vanished. Wu built a network of spies, palace servants, eunuchs, court scribes. She knew who whispered behind her back. And she acted before those whispers turned into daggers. But she didn't just rule through fear. She was brilliant. She understood policy, taxes, military appointments, and diplomacy. She gave speeches. She hosted foreign dignitaries. She sat in on council meetings, breaking every tradition of female decorum, and nobody could stop her. Still, there were enemies. Confucian scholars hated her. Nobles whispered that she was a usurper, a woman of low birth, and the most dangerous woman in history. You've never heard of unfit ruler. They called her a seductress, a manipulator, even a murderer, and she gave them reasons to be afraid. There's one infamous story, grim and brutal, that captures her ruthlessness. Empress Wang, Wu's old rival, and consort Xiao, another former threat, had both been deposed. But Wu didn't stop there. She had them arrested. Their limbs were cut off, their bodies thrown into wine vats, their remains displayed as warnings. Whether the tale is fully true or partially exaggerated, it tells us one thing. Wu Zetian didn't believe in loose ends. By the mid-660s, her grip on the court was absolute. She wasn't just the emperor's wife. She was his voice, his mind, his hand, and when he became too weak to rule, she made herself emperor in all but name. She held court, issued orders, governed with precision. The most dangerous woman in history. You've never heard of the empress had become the empire, and nobody could stop her. Because by the time they realized what had happened, Wu Zetian was already the most powerful person in China. In 683 AD, everything changed. Emperor Gaozong, Wu Zetian's husband and the man she'd ruled beside for over 2 decades, died. Most emperors' deaths meant an automatic shift in power. The next male heir takes over. The empress becomes a ceremonial figure, a widow behind the curtain. Power passes to the next man. But not this time. Wu Zetian wasn't going anywhere. She had spent years building her base, installing loyal ministers, eliminating threats, winning the trust of the army, the scholars, the court. So when Gaozong died, she stepped into a new role. The Empress Dowager. The Queen Mother. Officially, the new emperor was her son, but Wu Zetian had no intention of handing over real power. The most dangerous woman in history. You've never heard of her son, Zhongzong, tried asserting his independence, tried appointing his own people, tried pushing her out. Big mistake. Wu Zetian had him removed after just 6 weeks. She replaced him with his younger brother, Ruizong, a quieter son, easier to control. She ruled in his name, too. And then, she stopped pretending. She declared that she would rule directly, not as regent, not as dowager, not behind the scenes. She stepped out of the shadows and into the throne room. This was unthinkable. No woman had ever declared herself emperor. The title reserved for the Son of Heaven, the absolute ruler of China. Wu Zetian rewrote that rule. She declared the founding of a new dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, effectively canceling the Tang for the next 15 years. The most dangerous woman in history. You've never heard of. She didn't just rule. She erased the idea that she couldn't, and it shook the world. Confucian scholars were outraged. They believed in hierarchy, in gender roles, in stability. A woman on the throne wasn't just wrong, it was dangerous, a disruption to the cosmic order. Wu ignored them. She issued new coinage, new rituals. She held court in the open like any male emperor. She demanded loyalty, obedience, and reverence. And for years she got it, because make no mistake, she wasn't just surviving. She was thriving. She expanded China's territory. She protected the Silk Road. She improved the exam system for civil servants, allowing more people from poor backgrounds to enter government, which meant more people loyal to her, not old noble families. Wu Zetian ruled like a statesman, but punished like a tyrant. She created a secret police, tortured dissenters, executed rivals. Even her own family wasn't safe. Some of her children were rumored to have been poisoned, others imprisoned. The most dangerous woman in history you've never heard of. To some, she was a hero. To others, a monster. To history, she was unstoppable. She wasn't just Empress Dowager, she was Emperor Wu, and the world had never seen anything like her before. By the time Wu Zetian declared herself emperor in 690 AD, her takeover was already complete. But how she got there, that's the real masterpiece. Because Wu didn't storm the palace gates, she didn't lead armies or stage a bloody coup. She took power like a slow-moving storm, silent, unstoppable, and always underestimated. Her strategy was simple. Blend tradition with disruption. She presented herself as a dutiful widow, a grieving mother, a loyal servant of the empire. But beneath the silks and ceremony was steel. She started by elevating her image. The most dangerous woman in history. You've never heard of statues of her appeared across the empire. She commissioned new titles, not just Empress Dowager, but divine names connecting herself to Buddhist prophecies. She was the reincarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha, a bringer of peace and justice. This wasn't just ego, it was politics. Buddhism was popular with the masses. Confucianism favored male rule and aristocratic order. So Wu leaned into religion to bypass the elite and win the people. She used temples the way modern leaders use media. Sermons, symbols, and sacred scripts all pointed to one truth. Wu Zetian wasn't just a ruler, she was chosen. At the same time, she reshaped the government. She promoted officials based on merit, not birth. She established new exams. She broke the monopoly of noble families. That made her enemies in high places, but allies everywhere else. She built a new aristocracy, one loyal to her alone. And for those who opposed her. She didn't flinch. She used secret police to root out dissent, torture chambers, anonymous accusations, the most dangerous woman in history. You've never heard of purges. Ministers disappeared. Families vanished. Her court was efficient and terrifying. But it wasn't chaos. It was calculated. Even as she cracked down, she governed well. Roads were repaired. Trade flourished, Crops were taxed fairly. The empire was more stable than it had been in decades. The people saw results, and the elite saw the gallows. By 690, her son Ruizong was emperor in name only. So she stripped him of that title, declared the Tang dynasty finished, and announced the start of the Zhou dynasty, with herself as the one and only emperor. No woman had ever done that before. No woman ever would again. Her coronation was lavish, but her message was sharp. This throne isn't a gift. It's mine because I earned it. And with that, Wu Zetian became the most powerful woman in Chinese history, and maybe the most dangerous woman the world had ever seen. But even in victory, she knew the throne was fragile. The most dangerous woman in history you've never heard of, so she ruled with an iron fist and wrapped it in silk. Wu Zetian had done what no woman had ever done in the 3,000-year history of China. She wasn't the power behind the throne anymore. She was the throne. She took the title Huangdi, Emperor, the same title used by the likes of Qin Shi Huang and Han Wudi. She erased her son's reign from the records and declared the start of a new dynasty, the Zhou dynasty. From 690 to 705 A.D., Wu Zetian ruled China as its sole sovereign. She wasn't just symbolic. She was active, engaged, and feared. She held court in the Hall of Supreme Harmony. She summoned ministers, reviewed policies, managed military campaigns, oversaw the construction of monuments and temples, and yet she didn't rule like a man. She didn't pretend to be one either. She ruled as a woman who knew how to play a man's game and win it. Wu understood the optics. She surrounded herself with symbols of divine favor. She elevated the most dangerous woman in history. You've never heard of Buddhism above Confucianism, and used its teachings to justify her rule. Images of the Maitreya Buddha began to resemble her own likeness. She even commissioned a series of miracles, strange signs and prophecies that all conveniently pointed to her being chosen by heaven. Critics called it manipulation. Supporters called it enlightenment. But whatever you call it, it worked. She made her rule seem inevitable, natural, fated. And in practice, she governed well. Her tax reforms helped stabilize the economy. Her exam-based bureaucracy opened the government to fresh talent. She expanded China's influence along the Silk Road, bringing trade and diplomacy into new regions. Even her enemies admitted she was effective. But make no mistake, she was also ruthless. She purged officials, tortured critics, imprisoned nobles. She surrounded herself with spies and informants, creating an atmosphere of fear. Two of her most infamous advisors, the Zhang brothers, were accused of abusing their positions. The most dangerous woman in history you've never heard of, manipulating the empress and corrupting the court. Whether that's true or not, the whispers grew louder as Wu aged. And aging, in a system built on strength, was dangerous. By her late 70s, Wu Zetian was losing her grip, not mentally, but politically. She fell ill. Ministers grew bolder, rivals plotted, and in 705, a palace coup forced her to abdicate. She was removed from power and replaced by her son. The Tang dynasty was restored. She lived a few more months, died quietly, and was buried with honor, but with one final haunting twist. Her tombstone was left blank. No name, no title, no epitaph. Only an empty stone. Because how do you summarize a life that broke every rule? The most dangerous woman in history you've never heard of. How do you describe the only woman who ruled as emperor in the world's longest-running empire? Maybe you don't. Maybe you just let the silence speak. Wu Zetian knew one thing better than anyone. Power is never safe and never silent. So while the empire saw stability and prosperity on the surface, behind the walls of the Forbidden City, a shadow war raged. Wu was surrounded by enemies, real, imagined, and waiting to become one. So she turned survival into an art form. She created a secret police unlike anything China had seen before. Its agents operated in silence, lurking in the palace, in temples, in tea houses. Their job was simple: listen, report, and eliminate threats. No accusation was too small, no whisper too quiet. Ministers, generals, nobles, and even monks disappeared overnight. The palace ran on fear and loyalty. The most dangerous woman in history you've never heard of. Wu's system of terror wasn't random. It was calculated. She understood that rumors, plots, and power plays couldn't just be punished. They had to be predicted, prevented, erased, and she knew how to spin fear into obedience. But censorship was just as crucial. Wu Zetian controlled not just who lived, but what people said, and how they remembered it. She rewrote imperial histories. She deleted rivals from the record. She inserted her own version of events, casting herself as heaven's chosen. She banned books, censored scholars, promoted loyal poets and historians who praised her as the savior of China. She controlled the narrative before it could be weaponized. And it worked. The people remembered peace and order, not the purges it took to achieve them. But her war on dissent went deeper than censorship. It reached into her own family. She was suspected of poisoning or imprisoning multiple sons, of executing in-laws, of silencing anyone who might pose a threat, even if they shared her blood. The most dangerous woman in history you've never heard of. To Wu Zetian, loyalty didn't come from lineage. It came from usefulness. And when you were no longer useful, you were expendable. Her two most controversial allies, the Zhang brothers, were symbols of both her strength and her vulnerability. They were young, charming, manipulative. Some said they were lovers, others said they were puppeteers, but all agreed they had influence. They helped her run the court, they kept her informed, and they made her enemies bold. Because as Wu aged, the court stopped fearing her and started fearing them. And when the coup came, it was the Zhang brothers who were first to die. Their executions were brutal, public, symbolic, and after they fell, Wu Zetian was forced to abdicate. But even then, even with enemies closing in, even with the dynasty restored, she wasn't publicly condemned. She wasn't humiliated. She was buried with full honors because she had spent her life eliminating every threat until the only thing left to defeat her was time itself. The most dangerous woman in history. You've never heard of Wu Zetian. Didn't just fight her enemies. She outlasted them. Wu Zetian understood something most rulers never figure out. Power doesn't last if people don't believe in it. So she made them believe. She didn't just seize power, she sanctified it. And she didn't just rule an empire, she ruled a story. That story began with Buddhism. At the time, Confucianism dominated Chinese politics, strict, male-centered, and obsessed with order. It hated the idea of a female ruler. But Buddhism, that was more flexible, mystical, popular among the people, and open to new interpretations. Wu saw an opening, and she used it. She allied herself with Buddhist monks who declared her the reincarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha who would bring a new era of peace. Sermons were written, statues erected, scriptures discovered in sacred caves, all conveniently pointing to Wu as heaven's chosen ruler. It was a religious rebrand. The most dangerous woman in history you've never heard of. And it worked. The people didn't just accept her rule. They began to see it as divine. She commissioned giant statues of herself as a bodhisattva. She funded temples. She turned religion into public relations, and the monasteries into megaphones. But it didn't stop there. Wu Zetian reshaped history, literature, and language itself. She edited imperial records to favor her reign, promoted historians who praised her intelligence, wisdom, and destiny. She even created new Chinese characters, symbols that reflected her rule and removed traditional gender bias. She understood that if you want to change how people think, You have to change the words they use to think it. And she was right. Her era became a period of cultural brilliance. Poetry, art, and scholarship thrived as long as they served her narrative. She elevated women in literature, sponsored female writers, encouraged the idea that women could be philosophers, rulers, and sages. The most dangerous woman in history. You've never heard of, but none of it was accidental. This wasn't kindness, it was strategy. The cult of Wu wasn't about worship, it was about control. Because when people believe a ruler is divine, they stop asking if she's dangerous. Wu's image, as a spiritual mother, a wise sage, a chosen one, wasn't just propaganda, it was armor. It protected her from the court, from the scholars, from history. And even after her death, it survived. Temples still held her statues, scrolls still carried her story. And generations later, people still debated, was she a tyrant or a goddess? Maybe she was both. But either way, she proved something chilling and powerful. If you control what people believe, you don't need to control what they do, because faith is stronger than fear. The most dangerous woman in history you've never heard of, and Wu Zetian, she ruled with both. Even the most powerful ruler can't rule forever. By the time Wu Zetian reached her late 70s, her body began to fail, but her mind stayed sharp. Still, the cracks in her empire were beginning to show. The Zhang brothers, her closest confidants and rumored lovers, had become symbols of corruption. The court despised them, and Wu, increasingly isolated, relied on them more and more. That was the moment her enemies were waiting for. In 705 AD, a coup erupted inside the palace. A group of ministers and generals stormed the court. The Zhang brothers were executed immediately, their bodies dragged through the streets. Wu Zetian, weakened and surrounded, was given a choice: abdicate or die. She abdicated. After 15 years on the throne, and nearly 50 years holding real power, Wu Zetian stepped down. The Tang dynasty was restored. Her son was placed back on the throne. The court moved quickly to erase the Zhou dynasty from official records. But they couldn't erase her. The most dangerous woman in history you've never heard of, because Wu had already rewritten the empire in policy, in language, in belief. Even as she stepped down, the structures she built remained. The exam system she expanded, still in place. The new aristocracy she empowered, still loyal. The Buddhist temples she funded, still spreading her story. She died later that same year, quietly, no execution, no exile. Just the end of a reign that should have been impossible. Her tombstone, famously, was left blank. No name, no title, no legacy chiseled in stone. But maybe that was fitting. Because Wu Zetian didn't need a carved epitaph. She had history, and history has never forgotten her. In the centuries that followed, scholars tried to demonize her. They called her cruel, vain, immoral, manipulative. They painted her as a warning to any woman who dared reach beyond her station. The most dangerous woman in history. You've never heard of, but others remembered something else. A ruler who stabilized China during one of its most volatile eras. A woman who rose from concubine to emperor. A strategist who understood power, fear, and belief better than any of her rivals. Wu Zetian didn't just change the game. She flipped the board, and while she fell from power, her impact never did. Because the question she left behind still echoes today. If a woman can rule better than a man, why should she have to pretend she's not? Wu Zetian is remembered, but not always by name. She's the blank tombstone, the villain in ancient texts, the warning in a scholar's lecture, the shadow behind a throne no woman was supposed to touch, because history didn't just record her. The most dangerous woman in history, you've never heard of it, tried to erase her. After her death, the Tang dynasty moved fast to bury the Zhou era and everything it stood for. Scrolls were rewritten, statues taken down. Her reign was downplayed, her name blackened, not just because she was powerful, but because she had made power look feminine, natural, inevitable, and that terrified people. Because if Wu Zetian's story could happen once, it could happen again. She had rewritten every rule, and for many in the ruling class, that was more dangerous than any war. A woman who didn't just rule behind a man, but who replaced him, who sat in the dragon throne, held the scepter, and signed edicts with her own seal. She proved something deeply inconvenient. Women could lead, command, reign, and not just as figureheads, but as emperors. And for centuries, that was a truth many didn't want written into history, so they tried to paint her as a freak, a unique anomaly, a seductress, a killer, a cautionary tale. They wrote of her affairs, her cruelty, her ambition, and never of her reforms, her intelligence, her skill. The most dangerous woman in history you've never heard of, but the story never fully disappeared. Because you can't erase someone who changed the world, modern historians now see her reign more clearly as one of innovation, of cultural growth, of administrative reform. She may have ruled with terror, but she also ruled with vision, and her shadow still stretches across time. In fiction, she appears as a villainess, a tragic queen, a goddess, a monster. Her story changes shape, but it always comes back, because Wu Zetian is too powerful to forget. She doesn't fit the mold. She broke it. She didn't lead like a man. She ruled like Wu. And that might be the most dangerous thing of all. Not that she was evil, not that she was cruel, but that she proved you could be a woman and be the most powerful person in the world. And once people see that, the most dangerous woman in history you've never heard of, they never unsee it. So yes, Wu Zetian terrified her enemies. But what really scared them was the idea that she might not be the last. Get updated soon? Hit that like button, subscribe, and comment below what history undiscovered stories you want to listen.